The house felt different without her laughter echoing through the halls. Mom had been gone for 3 months now, and I was finally ready to tackle the one place I'd been avoiding, the attic. She'd always been protective of that space, claiming it was just full of old junk and Christmas decorations. "Nothing interesting up there, sweetheart," she'd say whenever I offered to help organize it. But now it was mine, along with everything else in the old Victorian house that had been in our family for generations. My sister Rebecca thought I was crazy for wanting to keep it, but something about selling felt like betraying Mom's memory. So here I was, standing at the bottom of the pull-down ladder, flashlight in hand, ready to face whatever chaos awaited me. The smell hit me first. Musty cardboard mixed with something floral and old. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the small window, I realized Mom had been lying about the junk part. The attic was meticulously organized. Boxes lined the walls in neat rows, each labeled in her careful handwriting. Christmas decorations were indeed there, but they occupied only a small corner. The rest was something else entirely. I pulled down the first box marked Rebecca School Years and found perfectly preserved report cards, artwork, and photos from my sister's childhood. The next box was labeled David School Years. That was me. Mom had kept everything. Every terrible finger painting, every participation ribbon, every school photo where I looked like I'd been electrocuted. It was touching and overwhelming at the same time. But as I worked deeper into the attic, the labels became more cryptic. "Before," said one box. "After," said another. "Never again," was written on a small chest pushed far into the corner. That one made my stomach twist with unease. I opened Before first. Inside were photos I'd never seen. Mom as a young woman, maybe early 20s, with a man I didn't recognize. She looked happy in a way I'd rarely seen her, carefree. The man had dark hair and kind eyes, and in several photos he had his arm around her protectively. At the bottom of the box was a wedding dress, pristine white satin, that definitely wasn't the simple blue dress she'd worn when she married Dad. My hands trembled as I reached for the after box. More photos, but these told a different story. Mom looked haunted, thin, with bruises barely concealed by makeup. The kind man from the previous photos was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there were hospital bracelets, police reports with sections blacked out, and a restraining order against someone named Marcus Holloway. The final item in the box was a death certificate. Marcus Holloway died in a car accident 6 months before I was born. The date was circled in red ink, with "free" written beside it in Mom's handwriting. I sat back on my heels, trying to process what I was seeing. Mom had been married before Dad. She'd been hurt, maybe abused, by this Marcus person. And he'd died right around the time she would have met Dad. None of this made sense with the story I'd grown up hearing, that Mom and Dad were high school sweethearts who got married young and had me right away. The Never Again chest called to me from its corner hiding spot. My rational mind screamed to leave it alone, but I couldn't stop myself. The chest was locked, but I found a small key taped to the bottom. Inside was something that made my blood freeze. Letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to Mom, all from Marcus Holloway. But the postmarks were impossible. They continued for years after his supposed death. The most recent one was dated just 2 months ago, right before Mom got sick. "My darling Sarah," the latest letter read in spidery handwriting, "I know you think you escaped me, but death is just another room in the same house. I've been watching David grow up. Such a handsome boy. He has my eyes, don't you think? Soon, very soon, I'll be ready to meet my son properly." The letter fell from my shaking hands. My eyes? I rushed to the photos of Marcus, studying his face with new terror. The same dark brown eyes that stared back at me from every mirror. The same slightly crooked nose that Dad had always joked I definitely didn't get from him. More letters revealed the horrifying truth. Marcus had faked his death with help from some criminal contacts, disappearing just as Mom discovered she was pregnant with me. He'd been watching from the shadows for 26 years, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what he considered his. Mom had spent my entire life looking over her shoulder, moving us 3 times during my childhood, always checking locks twice, never fully explaining why. The final letter was different, typed instead of handwritten. "The cancer won't take you before I get what's mine. The boy belongs to me. I'll be coming for him soon. Give my love to David." It was dated the day before Mom died. I heard a car door slam outside. My body went rigid as footsteps approached the house. Slow, deliberate, confident. I wasn't expecting anyone. Rebecca was 3 states away. Dad was on his fishing trip and wouldn't be back until tomorrow. Through the attic window, I could see a man standing by a dark sedan, looking up at the house. Even from this distance, I could see the resemblance that had been hidden from me my entire life. Marcus Holloway was very much alive, and he'd been waiting for Mom to die so he could finally meet his son. My phone had no signal in the attic. The house phone was downstairs. Between me and escape stood a man who'd terrorized my mother for decades, and now wanted to claim me as some twisted inheritance. I understood now why Mom had been so protective, so paranoid, so insistent that I learned self-defense and always have an escape plan. She'd been preparing me for this moment my entire life. The front door rattled as someone tested the locks. Mom's voice echoed in my memory from countless safety drills I'd thought were just her being overprotective. "If anything ever happens, David, remember that the oak tree by your bedroom window has branches strong enough to hold you. And there's a spare car key hidden in the garden shed." I grabbed the letters and photos, stuffing them into my jacket. This was my truth now. Horrible as it was, and I needed evidence. As quietly as possible, I made my way to the attic ladder, listening to the sounds of someone moving around the first floor below. He was inside now, probably picking the locks just like Mom had always feared. "David?" The voice that called out was warm, paternal. Everything Mom had taught me not to trust. "Son, I know you're here. Your mother told you lies about me. I just want to talk, to finally meet my boy." I climbed down from the attic and eased toward my childhood bedroom. The oak tree waited outside my window, just as it always had during my nightmares. But this wasn't a nightmare anymore. This was the reality Mom had spent her life trying to prevent. As I opened my bedroom window, I heard footsteps on the stairs. "David, please, I'm your real father. I have so much to tell you, so much lost time to make up for." The branch held my weight as I'd known it would. Mom had made sure of that, probably checking it every year like everything else in her carefully constructed fortress of protection. As I dropped to the ground and ran toward the garden shed, I finally understood the weight she'd carried all these years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every normal moment of my childhood had been shadowed by the knowledge that this day would eventually come. The spare key was exactly where she'd promised, wrapped in plastic and buried under the loose brick. As I started the old Honda she'd taught me to drive stick shift on, just in case, I saw him silhouetted in my bedroom window, watching me escape just as she had planned. I drove to the police station with shaking hands and a box full of evidence that would finally put an end to the nightmare that had defined my mother's life. The letters were enough to prove Marcus's threats and harassment spanning decades. The faked death certificate she'd somehow obtained would unravel his carefully constructed new identity. 3 days later, Marcus Holloway was arrested at a motel 20 miles away. He'd been living under an assumed name, working construction jobs, and systematically hunting down information about our family. In his motel room, police found detailed plans of our house, photos of me taken without my knowledge, and journals spanning years of obsessive surveillance. The trial revealed everything: how Mom had been a 19-year-old college student when she married Marcus, thinking he was charming and protective; how that protection had quickly turned into control, then violence; how she'd finally found the courage to leave when she realized she was pregnant, only to discover that Marcus had faked his death to avoid prosecution for domestic violence charges. She'd built our entire life around keeping me safe from a monster who'd never stopped hunting us. Every family photo that looked slightly stiff, every time she'd insisted we move, every moment she'd seemed distracted or worried. It all made sense now. She'd been a warrior in disguise, fighting a war I'd never known was happening. The house felt different when I finally returned to finish cleaning out the attic. Mom's boxes of memories took on new meaning. Every saved report card and finger painting wasn't just nostalgia, it was proof of the normal childhood she'd fought to give me despite the terror that stalked our family. I found one last item I'd missed before, tucked behind the Christmas decorations: a letter addressed to me in Mom's handwriting, marked, "When it's over." Inside was a photo of her as a young woman, before Marcus, smiling freely without fear in her eyes. On the back she'd written, This is who I was before and who I hope to be again someday. You gave me the strength to survive, David. Now live freely for both of us. Marcus died in prison 6 months into his sentence, finally ending the nightmare that had shaped my family for over 2 decades. I kept the house, but I made changes. I turned Mom's carefully organized attic into a bright office space with skylights, filling it with life instead of hidden fears. Rebecca and I talk now about the mother we thought we knew versus the incredible woman she actually was. Every family has secrets, but ours had been protecting us from a monster we never knew existed. Mom's greatest accomplishment wasn't raising successful children. It was keeping us alive and innocent while single-handedly holding off a predator who never stopped hunting. The attic that once held our family's darkest secrets now holds something better. The truth, and finally, the peace Mom never got to experience. Sometimes I sit up there in the evening light, looking through those old photos of her laughing freely, and I understand that love isn't just about the moments we share, but about the battles we're willing to fight in silence to protect the people who matter most. The house felt different when I finally returned to finish cleaning out the attic. Mom's boxes of memories took on new meaning. Every saved report card and finger painting wasn't just nostalgia, it was proof of the normal childhood she'd fought to give me, despite the terror that stalked our family. I found one last item I'd missed before, tucked behind the Christmas decorations. A letter addressed to me in Mom's handwriting marked, "When it's over." Inside was a photo of her as a young woman, before Marcus, smiling freely without fear in her eyes. On the back, she'd written, "This is who I was before, and who I hope to be again someday. You gave me the strength to survive, David. Now live freely for both of us." But freedom wasn't as simple as Mom had hoped it would be. The revelation that my entire life had been built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies left me reeling in ways I hadn't expected. I'd always wondered why I felt different from Dad, not just physically, but in temperament. Where he was gentle and patient, I had flashes of anger that seemed to come from nowhere. Where he was content with routine, I craved constant movement and change. Now I knew why. The man I'd called Dad my entire life, Robert Chen, had known the truth from the beginning. When he found Mom, she was 6 months pregnant, working 3 jobs, and jumping at every shadow. He'd fallen in love with her courage, he told me later, and with the fierce way she protected the child she carried. He'd married her knowing he was taking on not just a wife and stepson, but a lifetime of vigilance against a ghost who might one day become real. "She made me promise never to tell you," Dad explained when I confronted him after the trial. We were sitting in his workshop, surrounded by the wooden toys he'd carved for me as a child, each one a labor of love from a man who'd chosen to be my father in every way that mattered. "She was terrified that if you knew about Marcus, you'd blame yourself for the danger we all lived in. She wanted you to have a normal childhood, even if she couldn't have a normal life." The weight of their sacrifice hit me then. Every family vacation that had been planned with multiple escape routes. Every time Mom had insisted on driving me to school instead of letting me take the bus. Every house we'd lived in had been chosen for its sightlines and exit strategies. Dad had learned to sleep lightly, keeping a baseball bat by his side of the bed for 26 years. They'd both lived in a state of constant alert so I could live in blissful ignorance. "Did you ever regret it?" I asked him. "Taking on someone else's nightmare?" Dad's hand stilled on the piece of wood he'd been sanding. "David, you weren't someone else's nightmare. You were my son from the moment I held you. And your mother wasn't damaged goods. She was the strongest person I've ever known. If anything, I wasn't sure I was worthy of the trust she placed in me." As the months passed, I began to understand the true scope of what Mom had endured. The detective assigned to Marcus's case, Detective Sarah Williams, became a frequent visitor as we pieced together the timeline of his surveillance. She'd been investigating missing persons cases for 15 years, but she'd never seen anything like the methodical stalking Marcus had conducted. "He was patient in a way that defies normal criminal behavior," Detective Williams explained as we sat through yet another evidence review. "Most stalkers burn out or escalate quickly. Marcus treated this like a career. He built an entire false identity, maintained steady employment, and managed to stay under the radar for decades while systematically gathering intelligence on your family. The evidence they'd recovered from his motel room painted a picture of obsession that went far beyond what I'd initially understood. Marcus had detailed floor plans of every house we'd ever lived in. He knew my school schedules, my friends' names, my part-time job locations. He'd been taking photographs of me since I was a teenager, always from a distance, always careful not to be detected. Most disturbing were the journals, page after page of his thoughts about me, analyzing my mannerisms for traces of himself, critiquing the way Mom and Dad had raised me. He'd convinced himself that I was being held prisoner by people who were poisoning me against my real father. In his mind, he wasn't a stalker. He was a devoted parent being kept from his child by kidnappers. The psychological evaluation classified him as having an extreme form of narcissistic personality disorder combined with delusional thinking, Detective Williams told me. He genuinely believed he was the victim in this situation. That level of self-deception made him incredibly dangerous because he felt justified in any action he might take. The trial itself was a surreal experience. Sitting in that courtroom watching Marcus in his orange jumpsuit, I kept searching his face for traces of myself. The resemblance was undeniable. We had the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of tilting our heads when we were thinking. But where I'd inherited his physical features, I'd been saved from inheriting his darkness by two people who'd loved me enough to stand between me and my genetic destiny. Marcus's lawyer tried to paint him as a grieving father who'd made poor choices in his desperation to connect with his son. The prosecution had a mountain of evidence that told a very different story. 26 years of harassment, stalking, and terroristic threats. The fake death certificate that had allowed him to escape prosecution for domestic violence. Most damning were his own journals, which revealed plans to kidnap me and deprogram me from the lies I'd been told about him. I was called to testify, something I'd been dreading for months. Facing Marcus across that courtroom, seeing the way he looked at me with a mixture of pride and possessiveness, made my skin crawl. His lawyer asked me about my childhood, trying to establish that I'd been happy and well-adjusted, implying that Marcus couldn't be that dangerous if his son had turned out fine. What the lawyer didn't understand was that I'd turned out fine because Marcus had been kept away from me. Every stable moment of my childhood had been bought with my parents' constant vigilance. Every peaceful night's sleep had been protected by two people who never slept peacefully themselves. "Your Honor," I said when given the chance to address the court, "the man sitting at that table isn't my father. He's a stranger who shares my DNA. My father is the man who taught me to ride a bike, who helped me with homework, who showed up to every baseball game even though he was terrified of being in public places where we might be vulnerable. My father is the man who chose to love me, not the man who spent decades planning to take me." Marcus was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge cited the extraordinary length and severity of his stalking campaign, along with the credible threat he posed to multiple victims. As they led him away, he turned to look at me one last time. There was no remorse in his eyes, only frustration that his plans had been thwarted. But the end of the trial didn't mean the end of my reckoning with the truth. If anything, it opened up new questions about who I was and who I might have become under different circumstances. I found myself studying my reflection obsessively, wondering what parts of my personality came from Marcus and what parts were truly mine. Did my quick temper mean I was destined to become violent? Did my intensity in relationships come from some inherited capacity for obsession? Rebecca, who'd always been the calm, analytical one in our family, became my anchor during this period of self-doubt. She'd taken the revelations about our family differently than I had, focusing on the practical implications rather than the existential ones. "You're catastrophizing," she told me during one of our long phone conversations. "You think because you share DNA with a monster, you're destined to become one. But David, you've had 26 years to show us who you are. You're kind, you're protective of people you love. And you've never shown even a hint of the controlling behavior that defined Marcus. Biology isn't destiny." Still, I found myself second-guessing every emotion, every reaction. When I got angry at a rude driver, was that normal frustration or a glimpse of inherited rage? When I felt protective of my girlfriend Emma, was that healthy concern or the beginning of possessive control? The uncertainty was eating me alive. Emma had been incredibly patient with me throughout the trial and its aftermath, but I could see the strain my paranoia was putting on our relationship. We'd been together for 2 years, and she'd been planning to move in with me before all this happened. Now I was pushing her away, convinced that getting too close to me was dangerous for her. "You're not him," she said one evening when I'd canceled another date because I was feeling too much like Marcus. We were sitting on her couch, and she'd clearly reached the end of her patience with my self-imposed isolation. "David, I've known you for 2 years. I've seen you angry, frustrated, jealous, all of it. You've never once made me feel afraid or controlled. You're nothing like the man they described in court." "But what if I could be?" I asked. "What if the right circumstances, the right amount of stress could flip some switch in my brain? What if it's dormant but still there?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then she said something that cut through all my fears with surgical precision. "Your mother lived with that exact same fear for 26 years. She was terrified that Marcus had left some mark on you that would eventually surface. But she didn't let that fear stop her from loving you completely. If she could have faith in who you really are, why can't you?" It was a turning point, but not an instant cure. Learning to trust myself again was a process that took months of therapy and countless conversations with Dr. Patricia Morrison, a psychologist who specialized in families affected by stalking and domestic violence. She helped me understand that my hypervigilance about my own behavior was actually a healthy sign. It meant I was actively choosing not to repeat patterns that had damaged others. "Abusers don't typically worry about becoming abusive," Dr. Morrison explained during one of our sessions. "They justify their behavior, blame their victims, or deny the impact of their actions. The fact that you're so concerned about avoiding those patterns suggests you're constitutionally incapable of following them." Through therapy, I also began to understand the full scope of the trauma Mom had carried. She'd lived for over 2 decades with the knowledge that a dangerous man was hunting her family, never knowing when he might appear. The stress of that level of constant threat had shaped every decision she'd made, every relationship she'd formed, every moment of peace she'd stolen for herself. I started to see her differently, not as the overprotective mother who'd sometimes embarrassed me with her caution, but as a warrior who'd fought an invisible war to protect her family. The times she'd seemed distant or distracted hadn't been about not caring enough. They'd been about caring so much that she'd sacrificed her own peace of mind to maintain ours. Dad, too, took on new dimensions in my understanding. The man I'd always seen as mild-mannered and gentle had actually been a guardian, ready to defend his family against a threat that most people couldn't even imagine. He'd learned to read Mom's moods, to recognize when her anxiety spiked, to smoothly redirect our family activities when she sensed danger. He'd been a partner in the truest sense, sharing a burden that would have broken most people. As I processed these revelations, I began to notice memories that made new sense. The time we'd suddenly left a vacation early because Mom had seen someone who looked familiar. The way she'd always insisted on accompanying me to school events instead of letting me go alone. The elaborate bedtime routine she'd maintained until I was embarrassingly old, checking every window and door before kissing me goodnight. Most telling was a memory from when I was 16. I'd been angry about some typical teenage grievance and had yelled at Mom that I wished Dad wasn't my real father because he was too boring. The look of devastation that had crossed her face had seemed disproportionate to my cruel but common adolescent outburst. Now I understood that my words had hit her deepest fear, that someday I would reject the man who'd chosen to be my father and long for the biological father who'd terrorized her. I'd apologized immediately, sensing I'd hurt her in a way I didn't understand, but she'd brushed it off with a forced smile. That night, though, I'd heard her crying in her room, and Dad's voice quietly comforting her. At the time, I'd assumed she was upset about normal parenting struggles. Now I realized she'd been crying for the son she was afraid she might lose to a monster who shared his DNA. The more I understood about my parents' sacrifice, the more determined I became to live a life worthy of their protection. I threw myself into work, into my relationship with Emma, into building the kind of future Mom had dreamed of when she'd written about living freely. But I also knew I needed to do something more concrete to honor their memory and struggle. That's when I decided to start speaking publicly about our experience. Detective Williams had mentioned that stalking cases often went unreported or were poorly handled by law enforcement because the crime was so misunderstood. Victims were often blamed for not being clear enough about their rejection of their stalkers, or were told to get restraining orders that provided no real protection against determined predators. My first speaking engagement was at a domestic violence shelter, sharing our story with other survivors who were trying to rebuild their lives after escaping dangerous relationships. It was terrifying to stand up there and admit that my entire childhood had been shaped by violence I'd never directly experienced, but the response was overwhelming. Person after person came up to thank me for helping them understand that their hypervigilance, their seemingly paranoid safety measures, their refusal to trust easily, these weren't character flaws, but survival strategies honed by necessity. One woman, Maria, told me about her ex-husband who'd violated multiple restraining orders and made threats against their children. She'd been labeled as overprotective by teachers and family members who thought she was being dramatic about the danger her ex posed. Hearing about Mom's 26-year campaign of protection helped her understand that her instincts weren't paranoia. They were maternal wisdom born of hard experience. Your mother saved you, Maria told me after my presentation. But she also saved my kids because hearing your story helped me trust my gut about keeping them safe. Sometimes we need permission to believe our own experiences, and you gave me that. These conversations with other survivors helped me process my own grief about the childhood I'd never known I'd lost. I'd grown up thinking my life was normal, even privileged. Learning that it had actually been a carefully constructed fortress meant mourning the carefree childhood I'd never had, even though I'd experienced something that felt carefree at the time. Dr. Morrison helped me understand that this was a form of complicated grief, mourning something I'd never known I'd missed. You're grieving the mother you would have had if she hadn't been forced to be a bodyguard, she explained. You're grieving the father-son relationship you would have had with Robert if he hadn't needed to be a sentinel. You're even grieving the person you might have been if you'd grown up without the weight of someone else's trauma shaping your world. But I was also learning to appreciate what I'd gained from parents who'd loved me enough to sacrifice their own peace for mine. I'd grown up with an unusual appreciation for safety and security, because I'd been surrounded by people who understood how precious and fragile those things could be. I'd learned to value loyalty and commitment because I'd been raised by people who'd proven that love meant showing up even when showing up was dangerous. The more I spoke publicly about our experience, the more I heard from other families dealing with similar situations. There were far more people living under the shadow of long-term stalking than I'd ever imagined. Parents who'd changed their names and moved across the country to escape violent ex-partners. Adult children who'd discovered that their paranoid parent had actually been protecting them from very real threats. Siblings who'd grown up with different last names because one parent was hiding from someone in their past. Each story reinforced something Mom had tried to tell me in that final letter, that survival sometimes requires strategies that look like pathology to people who've never been hunted. The hypervigilance that might seem like anxiety disorder to outsiders was actually finely tuned threat assessment born of experience. The seemingly excessive security measures weren't paranoia but wisdom earned through years of staying one step ahead of danger. I also began to understand the incredible community of support that had surrounded our family without my knowledge. Detective Williams introduced me to Agent Patricia Lopez, an FBI specialist in long-term stalking cases, who'd been consulted on Marcus's case behind the scenes. Agent Lopez revealed that there had been an entire network of professionals who'd been quietly monitoring our situation for years. Your mother was in contact with our domestic violence task force from the time you were 5 years old, Agent Lopez explained during one of our meetings. She'd call in periodically to report suspicious activity, vehicles that followed her too closely, phone calls with no one on the line, evidence that someone had been in your yard. Most people would have dismissed these as coincidence, but your mother understood that Marcus was too smart to make obvious moves. The task force had taken Mom's reports seriously because they'd verified Marcus's fake death early in their investigation. They'd known he was alive and likely monitoring our family, but they'd never been able to locate him or gather enough evidence for an arrest warrant. Mom's detailed documentation of suspicious incidents had helped them build a profile of his surveillance patterns, but Marcus had always been careful to stay just within the bounds of legal behavior. She was essentially doing the work of a trained investigator, Agent Lopez told me. Her attention to detail and her systematic documentation of threats were extraordinary. She never let her fear cloud her judgment or make her paranoid about innocent events. She was tracking a real predator with professional-level precision. Learning about this hidden network of protection made me realize how many people had been invested in keeping our family safe. Our neighbors, the Johnsons, had actually been part of an informal neighborhood watch that Mom had organized, though they'd never told me the real reason for their vigilance. My elementary school principal, Mrs. Martinez, had maintained special protocols for my pickup and drop-off that I'd thought were just school policy. Even our family doctor had been briefed on our situation and knew to watch for signs of trauma or stress. The revelation that so many adults in my life had been guardians without my knowledge was both comforting and overwhelming. I'd never been as alone or as vulnerable as I'd feared after learning about Marcus, but I'd also never been as free as I'd believed during my childhood. Every normal moment had been protected by an army of people who'd cared enough to stay alert on my behalf. Emma and I eventually got married in a small ceremony that felt like a celebration of more than just our love for each other. It was a declaration that the cycle of fear Marcus had tried to perpetuate would end with my generation. Dad walked me down the aisle and I could see the pride and relief in his eyes. Relief that the son he'd chosen to raise had grown into a man capable of healthy love and trust. Rebecca gave a speech at the reception that brought everyone to tears. She talked about how Mom had taught us to value safety without teaching us to live in fear, to be cautious without being paralyzed, to protect the people we loved without controlling them. She showed us that love means being willing to carry burdens so that others can live lightly, Rebecca said. And she taught us that the greatest gift we can give someone is the freedom to be themselves without fear. As Emma and I settled into married life, I found myself thinking often about the kind of parent I wanted to be if we decided to have children. I knew I never wanted my kids to feel the weight of threats they hadn't chosen, but I also didn't want them to grow up naive about the realities of a world where dangerous people sometimes fixate on innocent families. The balance Mom had struck, protecting without terrifying, preparing without traumatizing, seemed almost impossibly delicate. How do you teach children to be appropriately cautious without stealing their innocence? How do you honor the sacrifice of those who protected you while building a life that's genuinely free rather than just safely hidden? Dr. Morrison helped me understand that these questions didn't have perfect answers, and that was okay. Your mother figured it out as she went along, she reminded me. She made decisions based on love and her best understanding of what you needed at each stage of your development. That's all any parent can do. Marcus died in prison 6 months into his sentence, finally ending the nightmare that had shaped my family for over 2 decades. The news came on a Tuesday morning via a phone call from Detective Williams. He'd suffered a heart attack during what prison officials described as a routine medical examination. There was no indication of foul play. Apparently, decades of obsessive stress and rage had taken a toll on his cardiovascular system. I felt surprisingly little when I heard the news. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sense of anticlimax. This man who'd loomed so large in my family's story, who'd shaped every decision my parents had made for 26 years, had simply ceased to exist on an ordinary Tuesday in a prison medical unit. His death was mundane in a way his life had never been. Emma found me that evening sitting in what had once been Mom's carefully organized attic, now transformed into the bright office space, where I wrote articles about stalking prevention and family safety. She didn't say anything, just sat beside me in the comfortable silence we'd learned to share during the difficult months of processing my family's history. I keep thinking I should feel something more, I finally said, closure or justice or even satisfaction, but mostly I just feel tired. Maybe that's what closure actually feels like, Emma suggested. Not some dramatic sense of resolution, but just the quiet exhaustion of carrying a weight you can finally put down. She was right. Marcus's death didn't erase the years of fear my family had endured, didn't magically heal the trauma Mom had carried, didn't resurrect the carefree childhood I'd never known I'd missed. But it did mean that the active threat was finally over. No more looking over shoulders. No more checking locks twice. No more planning every family outing with escape routes in mind. I kept the house, but I made changes that would have made Mom smile. I turned her carefully organized attic into a bright office space with skylights, filling it with life instead of hidden fears. I installed a swing set in the backyard, where she'd never allowed permanent playground equipment because it might have made us too easy to find. I planted a garden in the front yard, something she'd always avoided because it required predictable outdoor time that could be observed by watchers. Most importantly, I learned to live freely in the way she'd always hoped I would. Not recklessly, not naively, but with the confidence that comes from understanding both the reality of danger and the power of love to overcome it. I spoke at conferences about stalking prevention, worked with law enforcement to improve their response to long-term harassment cases, and helped other families navigate the complex process of building safety without building prisons. Rebecca and I talk now about the mother we thought we knew versus the incredible woman she actually was. Every family has secrets, but ours had been protecting us from a monster we never knew existed. Mom's greatest accomplishment wasn't raising successful children. It was keeping us alive and innocent while single-handedly holding off a predator who never stopped hunting. The attic that once held our family's darkest secrets now holds something better: the truth, and finally, the peace Mom never got to experience. Sometimes I sit up there in the evening light, looking through those old photos of her laughing freely, and I understand that love isn't just about the moments we share, but about the battles we're willing to fight in silence to protect the people who matter most. But I also understand something Mom might not have fully grasped in her lifetime of vigilance: that the greatest victory over someone like Marcus isn't just survival, but the creation of something beautiful and free in spite of his attempts to destroy it. Every healthy relationship I build, every moment of genuine joy I experience, every choice I make from love rather than fear, is a repudiation of everything he represented. When Emma and I found out she was pregnant last month, my first instinct was the old fear: what if I pass on something dangerous to this child? What if the capacity for obsession or violence lies dormant in my DNA, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? But then I remembered something Dr. Morrison had told me months ago. The fact that you're asking these questions proves you're not the man you're afraid of becoming. This child will grow up knowing the truth about our family's history, but in an age-appropriate way that emphasizes the love and courage that protected us, rather than the fear that threatened us. They'll know about their grandmother who was a hero, their grandfather who chose love over safety, and their father who learned that being related to a monster doesn't make you monstrous. Most importantly, they'll grow up free from the shadows that haunted my childhood, free from the hypervigilance that consumed my mother's life, free to make choices based on hope rather than fear. That freedom, bought with my parents' sacrifice and protected by their love, is the most precious inheritance I can pass on. The Victorian house that once felt like a fortress now feels like a home. The attic that once held secrets now holds dreams. And the story that began with a young woman fleeing from a monster ends with her son building a life that monsters can never touch. Not because they don't exist, but because love builds walls they can never breach. When Emma and I found out she was pregnant last month, my first instinct was the old fear. What if I pass on something dangerous to this child? What if the capacity for obsession or violence lies dormant in my DNA, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? But then I remembered something Dr. Morrison had told me months ago. The fact that you're asking these questions proves you're not the man you're afraid of becoming. This child will grow up knowing the truth about our family's history, but in an age-appropriate way that emphasizes the love and courage that protected us, rather than the fear that threatened us. They'll know about their grandmother who was a hero, their grandfather who chose love over safety, and their father who learned that being related to a monster doesn't make you monstrous. The pregnancy brought unexpected gifts beyond the obvious joy of expecting our first child. Dad, who'd always been wonderful but somewhat reserved about expressing deep emotions, became almost giddy with excitement about becoming a grandfather. For the first time since Mom's death, I saw him planning for a future that stretched beyond just surviving each day. "Your mother would have been over the moon," he told me one afternoon, as we assembled a crib in what would be the nursery. His hands, still steady despite his 68 years, worked the Allen wrench with the same precision he'd brought to building my childhood toys. "She used to talk about grandchildren, about how maybe by then she could relax enough to just enjoy them without constantly calculating threats. It struck me then that Mom had never gotten to experience the simple pleasure of anticipating good things. Every milestone in my life had been shadowed by her need to stay vigilant. Every birthday party, every school play, every teenage achievement had been filtered through her assessment of whether celebrating might make us more visible to Marcus. She'd participated in my joy, but always with one eye on the exits. "Tell me about her dreams," I asked Dad as we worked. "The things she wanted to do when it was all over." Dad smiled, the kind of distant smile that meant he was accessing memories he didn't often share. "She wanted to travel, but not the way we always traveled. Constantly moving, never staying anywhere long enough to feel settled. She wanted to go somewhere just for fun, just to see beautiful things. She had this fantasy about visiting every lighthouse on the East Coast. Said they seemed like beacons of safety, places built specifically to guide people home. Did she ever get to visit any of them?" "Once. When you were 15, we went to Cape Hatteras for what she told you was a spontaneous vacation. She'd actually planned it for months, coordinating with the FBI task force to make sure Marcus hadn't been spotted in that area recently. But for 3 days, she let herself just enjoy the ocean and the lighthouse." I have a photo of her standing at the top, looking out at the water with this expression of pure peace. It was the only time in 20 years I saw her face completely unguarded. I remembered that trip. I'd been going through a typical teenage phase of finding family vacations embarrassing, but even I had noticed how different Mom seemed there. She'd laughed more freely, touched Dad more casually, and hadn't checked the locks on our hotel room even once. At the time, I'd attributed it to the relaxing effect of being near the ocean. Now I understood it had been a carefully orchestrated moment of freedom. "I'd like to see that photo," I said. "It's in my wallet. Has been for 10 years. Dad pulled out his worn leather wallet and extracted a slightly faded color photo. Mom stood silhouetted against the lighthouse's white tower, her hair caught by ocean wind, her face turned towards something beyond the camera's view. She looked young and hopeful in a way I'd rarely seen her. "She looks free," I said, studying the image. She was, for those 3 days. And she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Robert, someday when David has children of his own, I want to bring them here. I want to show them what it looks like when their grandmother isn't afraid." The weight of that unrealized dream hit me hard. Our child would never meet the grandmother who'd sacrificed everything to protect their father. They'd never see Mom's face light up with unguarded joy, never hear her laugh without that underlying note of vigilance, never experience the unconditional love she'd been waiting her whole adult life to give freely. But they would inherit the safety she'd fought to create. They would grow up in a world where checking locks twice was just good sense, not survival strategy. They would learn to trust their instincts because those instincts weren't shaped by decades of being hunted. They would be free to love boldly, travel spontaneously, and build relationships without constantly calculating the risks of letting people get close. Emma's pregnancy progressed smoothly, but it also brought unexpected challenges. As my wife's body changed and she became more vulnerable, I found myself struggling with protective instincts that felt uncomfortably familiar. I caught myself checking our home security system obsessively, researching the safest hospitals for delivery, and feeling anxious whenever Emma was out of my sight for more than a few hours. "You're doing it again," Emma said gently one evening when she found me reviewing the specifications for a new car seat for the 3rd time. "You're trying to protect us from every possible danger, just like your parents did for you." She was right, and it terrified me. What if I can't stop? What if I turn into them well-meaning but living in constant fear? "First of all," Emma said, settling beside me on the couch with the deliberate care of someone 6 months pregnant, "your parents weren't living in fear. They were living with a specific, real threat that required specific, real precautions. There's a difference between reasonable safety measures and paranoid control." But how do I know the difference? How do I know when I'm being appropriately protective versus when I'm projecting my family's trauma onto our situation? Emma was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I think the difference is in whether your protective instincts come from love or fear. Your parents' precautions came from love. They were trying to preserve your freedom and innocence. If your instincts are about controlling every variable to prevent any possible harm, that's fear. If they're about creating a safe foundation so our child can take appropriate risks and explore the world, that's love. Her wisdom reminded me why I'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Emma had a way of cutting through my overthinking and getting to the emotional truth of a situation. She was right. I needed to learn the difference between protection motivated by love and control motivated by fear. Dr. Morrison helped me work through these anxieties during our continued sessions. She explained that it was normal for adult children of trauma survivors to struggle with hyperprotectiveness when they became parents themselves. You're trying to prevent your child from experiencing any version of what your family went through, she said. But the goal isn't to eliminate all risk, it's to raise a child who can navigate risk intelligently. Your mother couldn't teach you those skills because she was dealing with an extraordinary situation that required extraordinary measures, Dr. Morrison continued. But you can teach your child how to assess normal risks and make good decisions about their safety. You can give them what your mother wished she could have given you, the confidence that comes from understanding danger without being paralyzed by it. As Emma entered her third trimester, I threw myself more deeply into my advocacy work, channeling my protective energy into helping other families navigate similar situations. I'd been invited to speak at a national conference on domestic violence prevention, sharing our story alongside law enforcement experts and other survivors. The response to my presentation was overwhelming. Afterward, a woman named Jennifer approached me with tears in her eyes. She'd been living under an assumed name for 8 years, hiding from an ex-husband who'd made credible threats against her and her 2 children. Like Mom, she'd been carrying the burden of protecting her family while trying to give them a normal childhood. "I've been so afraid that I was damaging my kids by being overprotective," Jennifer told me. "But hearing about your mother, how she managed to raise you to be healthy and confident while keeping you safe, it gives me hope that I'm not ruining their lives by being careful." "What does your overprotectiveness look like?" I asked, genuinely curious about how other families managed similar situations. "I don't let them walk to school alone, even though all their friends do. I insist on meeting the parents of any child they want to visit. I won't let them post anything on social media or participate in activities where photos might be published online. I know it makes them feel different from their peers, but I'm terrified that their father will find us if I let my guard down." Jennifer's strategies sounded remarkably similar to the precautions Mom had taken during my childhood. The hypervigilance that had seemed like excessive worry from the outside had actually been carefully calibrated threat assessment based on real danger. "Have you explained to your children why these precautions are necessary?" I asked. "Not really. I tell them it's for their safety, but I don't want to scare them by explaining that their father might hurt them. I'm trying to protect their innocence the way your mother protected yours." This conversation helped me understand something important about my own childhood. Mom's decision to shield me from the truth about Marcus hadn't just been about preserving my innocence. It had been about preventing me from carrying the psychological burden of knowing I was being hunted. The weight of that knowledge would have fundamentally changed who I became as a person. But there were costs to that approach too. I'd grown up sometimes feeling confused by Mom's seemingly arbitrary rules and restrictions. I'd occasionally rebelled against safety measures that felt unnecessary because I didn't understand their purpose. If I'd known we were being stalked, I might have been more cooperative with the precautions, but I also might have become fearful and hypervigilant myself. Finding the right balance, giving children enough information to understand why safety matters, without burdening them with adult-level awareness of danger, seemed like one of the most challenging aspects of protective parenting. I made a mental note to discuss this with Dr. Morrison, and to think carefully about how Emma and I would handle similar decisions with our own child. The conference also connected me with Agent Lopez's new partner, Agent Michael Chen, no relation to Dad, despite the shared surname, who'd taken over the FBI's Domestic Violence Task Force. Agent Chen was particularly interested in the long-term surveillance patterns Marcus had employed, seeing them as a template for understanding how other sophisticated stalkers might operate. "Cases like yours are becoming more common," Agent Chen explained during a dinner meeting after the conference. "Technology has made it easier for determined predators to track their victims over long periods without detection. Your mother's documentation strategies and your family's security protocols could be invaluable for training other families in similar situations." This led to an unexpected opportunity. Agent Chen invited me to help develop a training program for law enforcement and victim services professionals, teaching them how to recognize and respond to long-term stalking cases. The program would use our family's experience as a case study, showing how effective protection strategies could allow victims to live full lives while staying safe. Working on this project felt like the most meaningful way I could honor Mom's memory and Dad's sacrifice. Their 26 years of vigilance would become a resource for helping other families navigate similar dangers. The expertise they'd developed through necessity would be shared with professionals who could use it to save other lives. Emma was incredibly supportive of this work, even as her pregnancy advanced, and she needed more help with daily tasks. "This is how we turn your family's trauma into something generative," she said one evening as I worked on training materials at our kitchen table. "Instead of just surviving what happened to you, you're using it to prevent the same thing from happening to other families." Her perspective helped me see my advocacy work not as an obligation born of guilt, but as a natural extension of the love that had protected me. Just as Mom had channeled her fear into effective action to keep me safe, I was channeling my understanding into effective action to keep other families safe. The training program launched 3 months before our baby was due. The first cohort included victim advocates, police detectives, FBI agents, and family court judges from 12 states. Seeing these professionals learn from our family's experience, seeing them understand the difference between paranoid behavior and informed caution, felt like a victory Mom would have appreciated. One of the most powerful moments during the training came when Detective Williams, who'd arrested Marcus, spoke about the importance of believing victims who reported long-term harassment. "Sarah Chen called our department hundreds of times over the years," she told the assembled group. "Another officer might have dismissed her as paranoid or attention-seeking, but she was documenting real surveillance by a genuinely dangerous person. Her persistence and detailed record-keeping were what allowed us to build a case against her stalker when he finally made his move." "The lesson," Detective Williams continued, "is that victims of long-term stalking often become experts in their own cases. They develop sophisticated threat assessment skills because their lives depend on it. Law enforcement needs to recognize and respect that expertise instead of dismissing it as anxiety or overreaction." After the training, several participants reached out to share how the program had changed their approach to similar cases. A family court judge in Ohio restructured how her court handled custody cases involving domestic violence, implementing new protocols for protecting families from vengeful ex-partners. A police chief in Colorado revised his department's policies for investigating stalking complaints, emphasizing the importance of taking long-term harassment seriously even when individual incidents seemed minor. Most gratifying was hearing from victim advocates who felt better equipped to help families develop comprehensive safety plans. Many of them had been trained to focus on immediate crisis intervention, but our program taught them how to think strategically about long-term protection in cases where the threat might persist for years or even decades. As Emma's due date approached, I found myself thinking more and more about the kind of father I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to be present and engaged like Dad had been, but I also wanted to avoid the hypervigilance that had shadowed his parenting. I wanted to teach our child to be appropriately cautious without being fearful, to trust their instincts without seeing threats everywhere. Most importantly, I wanted to model healthy relationships for our child. One of the most damaging aspects of growing up under Marcus's shadow had been watching my parents' relationships strain under the constant pressure of staying alert. They'd loved each other deeply, but they'd rarely been able to just enjoy each other's company without the underlying tension of shared vigilance. Emma and I had built our relationship in the aftermath of learning about my family's history, so we'd had the advantage of processing that trauma together rather than carrying it separately. Our child would grow up seeing parents who could disagree without fear of violence, who could be vulnerable with each other without fear of that vulnerability being weaponized, who could trust each other completely because neither of us had ever given the other reason for suspicion. The day Emma went into labor, I experienced a moment of pure panic that had nothing to do with normal new parent anxiety and everything to do with my inherited hypervigilance. As we drove to the hospital, I found myself checking the rearview mirror obsessively, taking an indirect route in case we were being followed, calculating which exit routes would be available from the maternity ward. David, Emma said gently as we pulled into the hospital parking garage, Marcus is dead, the threat is over. You can just be excited about meeting our baby without worrying about keeping us safe from dangers that don't exist anymore. She was right, but letting go of those protective instincts felt like betraying the lessons my parents had taught me through their actions, if not their words. How do you suddenly start trusting the world when you've been raised by people who understood that the world sometimes contains predators who target innocent families? I know he's dead, I said as we walked slowly toward the hospital entrance, Emma pausing occasionally as contractions intensified. But what if there are other people like him? What if our child becomes a target for some reason we can't predict? What if I let my guard down and something happens because I wasn't paying attention? Emma stopped walking and turned to face me, her hands on my shoulders. David, listen to me. The odds of our child being targeted by a long-term stalker are incredibly small. Marcus wasn't a random predator. He was specifically obsessed with your mother, and then with you, because you were connected to her. That situation isn't going to repeat itself with our baby. But what if it does? Then we'll handle it the way your parents did, with love, intelligence, and whatever resources we need to keep our family safe. But we can't live our lives preparing for a disaster that will probably never happen. Our child deserves parents who can enjoy their childhood, not parents who are constantly braced for attack. Her words echoed something Dr. Morrison had told me months earlier. Your parents fought so you could live freely. If you spend your life waiting for the next threat, you're not honoring their sacrifice. You're letting Marcus win retroactively. Our daughter was born at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. The moment the doctor placed her in my arms, still slippery and screaming with the indignation of someone who'd been perfectly comfortable where she was, I felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just love, though the love was overwhelming. It was a sense of completion, of a story finally reaching its intended ending. This tiny person represented everything my parents had fought to protect and preserve. She was the future they'd dreamed of during those long nights of checking locks and reviewing security protocols. She was the proof that love could triumph over the most persistent evil, that ordinary people could defeat monsters through sheer determination and sacrifice. I named her Sarah, after Mom, but we call her Sadie. She has Emma's calm temperament and easy smile, but when she's concentrating on something interesting, she gets this little furrow between her eyebrows that's pure dad. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in her expressions, but so far I haven't seen any trace of Marcus. Maybe that's because she's growing up surrounded by love instead of threat, security instead of fear. Dad cried when he held his granddaughter for the first time, the kind of deep cathartic tears that seemed to release decades of held tension. She's perfect, he whispered, studying her tiny face with wonder. And she's safe. She's finally, completely safe. Rebecca flew in from Seattle to meet her niece, bringing photo albums I'd never seen before. While Emma rested and I paced the room with a fussy Sadie, Rebecca showed me pictures from Mom's childhood and teenage years, images of a young woman who'd been carefree and trusting before Marcus had entered her life. I wanted you to see who she was before, Rebecca said quietly, before the fear, before the vigilance, before she had to become a protector instead of just a person. I think Sadie has her eyes. Looking at those photos while holding my daughter, I could see the continuum of our family's story. Mom's early innocence had been interrupted by violence, but it hadn't been destroyed. She'd preserved it, protected it, and passed it on through me to this new generation. Sadie would grow up with the security Mom had never had, the trust Mom had learned to suspend, the freedom Mom had fought to create. The first few months of Sadie's life were a revelation in ways I hadn't expected. Caring for someone so completely vulnerable triggered all my protective instincts, but it also taught me to distinguish between reasonable precautions and excessive anxiety. Baby-proofing our house was a practical necessity. Installing a sophisticated security system was reasonable given our family history. But checking on Sadie every 10 minutes while she slept was anxiety, not protection. Emma had an easier time finding the right balance, perhaps because she hadn't inherited the hypervigilance that ran in my family. She was appropriately careful, researching pediatricians thoroughly, baby-proofing outlets and sharp corners, never leaving Sadie unattended on elevated surfaces. But she didn't agonize over every decision or calculate threats that existed only in my imagination. She's a healthy baby in a safe home with parents who love her, Emma reminded me when I worried about whether our neighborhood was secure enough, whether our babysitter had been background checked sufficiently, whether posting photos of Sadie on social media might somehow make her vulnerable to predators. She's not being hunted by anyone. She's just living her life, and she deserves parents who can live theirs. Gradually, I learned to trust Emma's instincts about what constituted appropriate caution versus inherited trauma response. When Sadie started crawling and I wanted to install padding on every corner and surface in our house, Emma gently pointed out that a few bumps and scrapes were part of normal childhood development. When I suggested we avoid taking Sadie to crowded places like malls or festivals, Emma reminded me that socialization and exposure to different environments were important for her development. Your mother couldn't take you to crowded places because they made surveillance easier for Marcus, Emma explained. But Sadie isn't being watched by anyone dangerous. She needs to experience the world, not hide from it. These conversations helped me understand that I was grieving not just for the childhood I'd never known I'd missed, but for the parenting experience my parents had never gotten to have. They'd never been able to relax and simply enjoy my development because they'd always been focused on protecting it. They'd never gotten to make parenting mistakes born of inexperience because all their decisions had been filtered through threat assessment. I didn't want to repeat that pattern with Sadie. I wanted to be able to celebrate her milestones without calculating whether they made her more visible to potential predators. I wanted to encourage her natural curiosity without constantly evaluating whether her explorations might be dangerous. I wanted to model for her that the world, while not perfect, was fundamentally safe enough to engage with boldly. This meant consciously working against 26 years of conditioning that had taught me to see potential threats everywhere. Dr. Morrison helped me develop strategies for distinguishing between realistic safety concerns and trauma-driven anxiety. Before making any decision about Sadie's activities or our family routines, I learned to ask myself, is this precaution based on a real risk, or is it based on my fear of repeating my family's experience? The distinction wasn't always clear, but having a framework for evaluation helped. Installing car seats properly and teaching Sadie not to talk to strangers were real safety measures. Refusing to let her play in our fenced backyard because someone might be watching from the street was trauma-driven anxiety. Teaching her our phone number and address was practical preparation. Avoiding all family photos or social media posts was inherited hypervigilance. As Sadie grew from infant to toddler, her personality emerged in ways that delighted and sometimes worried me. She was fearless in the way only children can be, approaching new situations with curiosity rather than caution. She'd climb anything climbable, explore any space she could access, and greet strangers with the confidence of someone who'd never learned to be afraid. Part of me loved seeing her natural boldness, recognizing it as evidence that she was growing up free from the shadows that had shaped my childhood. But part of me worried that she was too trusting, too willing to assume the best of people and situations. How do you teach appropriate caution to a child who's never needed to be cautious? You start with age-appropriate safety rules and build from there, Dr. Morrison advised when I shared these concerns. You teach her not to run into the street because cars are dangerous, not because someone might try to hurt her. You teach her about stranger safety because it's a reasonable precaution, not because she's being hunted by a specific predator. The goal is to give her tools for navigating the world safely without making her afraid of the world itself. Emma proved to be naturally gifted at this balance. She could redirect Sadie away from genuinely dangerous activities, while encouraging her to explore and take appropriate risks. She taught Sadie basic safety rules. Look both ways before crossing the street. Stay close to mommy and daddy in crowded places. Don't touch things that are hot or sharp, without making these rules seem scary or restrictive. Safety rules are how we take care of ourselves so we can have more fun, Emma would explain to Sadie. When we're safe, we can go more places and try more things. This framing helped Sadie see precautions as tools for expanding her world rather than restrictions that limited it. Watching Emma parent with this natural wisdom made me appreciate even more what my own parents had accomplished under impossible circumstances. They'd managed to raise me to be reasonably cautious without being fearful, appropriately trusting without being naive, all while dealing with a very real threat that most parents never have to consider. The fact that I had emerged from their protection with the capacity for healthy relationships and normal risk assessment was a testament to their skill and love. When Sadie turned 2, we decided to take her on her first real vacation, not a carefully planned security operation like my childhood trips, but a spontaneous long weekend at the beach. Emma found a family-friendly resort with a pool and playground, booked us a room with a view of the ocean, and made no advance contingency plans beyond packing extra diapers and snacks. The freedom of this approach was both exhilarating and terrifying for me. We were traveling without detailed research about local hospitals, without mapped escape routes, without coordination with any law enforcement contacts. We were just a normal family going on a normal vacation for purely recreational purposes. Sadie's joy at seeing the ocean for the first time was infectious. She squealed with delight at the waves, built sand castles with single-minded determination, and fell asleep each night exhausted from a full day of exploration and play. Watching her experience pure childhood happiness without any undercurrent of vigilance or fear made me understand what Mom had dreamed of when she'd imagined bringing grandchildren to visit lighthouses. On our last day at the beach, as Sadie napped in her stroller and Emma read beside me on the sand, I realized I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't scanning for threats, calculating risks, or maintaining awareness of exit strategies. I was simply present in a beautiful moment with my family, trusting that the world was safe enough to allow us this happiness. "This is what your mother wanted for you," Emma said softly, somehow sensing the significance of the moment. "She wanted you to be able to sit on a beach with your family and just enjoy it without worrying about anything more serious than sunscreen and snack time." She was right. This moment of uncomplicated family joy was the victory Mom had been fighting toward for 26 years. Not just survival, not just safety, but the freedom to live fully and love openly, without the shadow of threat hanging over every experience. As I write this, Sadie is now 3 years old, and I'm working on a book about our family's experience that will expand on the training program I developed with the FBI. The book will be part memoir, part practical guide for families dealing with long-term stalking situations. I want other parents to know that it's possible to protect children from real dangers without stealing their innocence, to maintain vigilance without living in fear, to build safety without building prisons. The attic office where I write overlooks the backyard where Sadie plays on the swing set Mom never allowed me to have. Sometimes I watch her through the window as she pumps her legs and reaches toward the sky, her laughter carrying on the wind like a promise that the future will be different from the past. She doesn't know yet that her grandmother was a hero, that her grandfather chose love over safety, that her father once lived under the shadow of a monster's obsession. Someday I'll tell her these stories, but I'll frame them as tales of triumph rather than trauma, examples of how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when love demands courage. For now, though, she just knows that she's loved completely, protected appropriately, and free to explore the world with the confidence that comes from growing up in safety. She knows that her parents trust her to make good choices, that her home is a place of refuge and joy, that her future is limited only by her own dreams and determination. The Victorian house that once felt like a fortress now feels like a launching pad. The family story that began with terror and obsession ends with love and freedom. And the little girl who plays in our backyard carries within her the best parts of all who came before: Mom's fierce protectiveness, Dad's steady love, and the hard-won wisdom that safety and joy can coexist. The monsters are gone, but the love remains. And in the end, that's the only inheritance that truly matters. The book project took longer to complete than I had anticipated, partly because every family I interviewed for research brought new layers of complexity to the story I was trying to tell. Through my advocacy work, I'd connected with dozens of survivors who'd lived through variations of our experience, and each story taught me something new about the resilience of human love in the face of persistent evil. There was Maria, the woman I'd met at my first speaking engagement, whose ex-husband had violated restraining orders for 8 years before finally being arrested for interstate stalking. Her children, now teenagers, were struggling with the revelation that their entire childhood had been shaped by a threat they'd never fully understood. Maria was grappling with when and how much to tell them about the danger they'd lived with, trying to balance their need to know with her desire to protect their mental health. There was James, a man whose mother had hidden him from his violent biological father for 15 years, only to have the father track them down through social media when James graduated high school. Unlike our situation, James had learned about the threat early in his childhood, and the knowledge had made him hypervigilant and anxious in ways that were still affecting his ability to form relationships as an adult. Most haunting was the story of the Patterson family, whose teenage daughter had been murdered by her mother's ex-boyfriend after he'd spent 3 years systematically learning their routines and security measures. The mother, Linda Patterson, had done everything right. She'd documented threats, worked with law enforcement, moved multiple times, and maintained constant vigilance. But sometimes, she told me through tears, love and preparation aren't enough to stop someone truly determined to cause harm. "I don't want you to include our story in your book to scare people," Linda said during one of our interviews. "I want you to include it because families need to know that even when the worst happens, it's not because they didn't do enough or love enough or fight hard enough. Sometimes evil wins individual battles, but that doesn't mean it wins the war." Linda's perspective helped me understand something crucial about Mom's story and my own. We'd been lucky in ways that went beyond Mom's skill and Dad's dedication. Marcus had died before he could escalate to violence, before his obsession could drive him to the kind of desperate action that had claimed Linda's daughter. Our happy ending wasn't just the result of our family's heroism. It was also the result of timing, chance, and the intersection of factors beyond anyone's control. This realization was both humbling and liberating. It meant I didn't have to carry the weight of feeling like our family had somehow earned our safety through superior planning or stronger love. It also meant that other families whose stories ended differently weren't failures. They were just dealing with variables that couldn't be controlled, regardless of how much love and intelligence they brought to their situation. Including Linda's story in the book felt essential, even though it made the narrative more complex and painful. Readers needed to understand that protective strategies could significantly improve a family's odds of staying safe, but they couldn't guarantee absolute security. The goal wasn't to eliminate all risk, which was impossible, but to reduce risk while maintaining the ability to live fully and love openly. As I worked on the book, Sadie continued to grow and develop in ways that constantly amazed me. By age 4, she was asking sophisticated questions about why some people lived in different kinds of families, why some children had to move frequently, and why adults sometimes seemed sad when they thought children weren't watching. Her curiosity about family differences led to some of our first conversations about the fact that her grandmother had faced some serious challenges before Sadie was born. I tried to frame it in age-appropriate language, explaining that Grandma Sarah had been very brave in protecting Daddy when he was little, and that sometimes adults have to work extra hard to keep their families safe. "Was Grandma Sarah scared?" Sadie asked one evening as I tucked her into bed. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but being brave doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. Like when I was scared of the dark, but I still went upstairs to get my stuffed animal?" Exactly like that. Grandma Sarah was scared sometimes, but she never let that stop her from taking care of the people she loved. These conversations felt like practice runs for the more detailed discussions we'd need to have as Sadie got older. I wanted her to understand her family history not as a source of trauma or fear, but as evidence of the extraordinary things ordinary people could accomplish when they were motivated by love. Dad proved to be an invaluable ally in this process. As Sadie's primary babysitter and most devoted companion, he had countless opportunities to share stories about Mom that emphasized her strength, intelligence, and love, rather than the circumstances that had required those qualities. He told Sadie about Mom's incredible memory for birthdays and anniversaries, her talent for making Halloween costumes from random household items, and her ability to turn any minor crisis into an adventure. "Your grandma was magic," he'd tell Sadie as they worked together in his garden. She could make a fort out of couch cushions that felt like a castle. And she could make scrambled eggs that tasted better than restaurant food. And she always knew exactly what to say when someone was feeling sad. "I wish I could have met her," Sadie said one day as they planted tomatoes. "You did meet her," Dad replied gently. "She held you when you were still in your mommy's tummy. She sang to you and told you stories about all the things you'd get to do when you were born. She loved you before she ever saw your face." The image of Mom talking to my unborn daughter brought tears to my eyes when Dad shared it with me later. Even in her final months, battling cancer and knowing she might not live to meet her grandchild, Mom had been focused on creating connection and love, rather than dwelling on what she might miss. Rebecca visited more frequently as Sadie grew older, and she became another source of stories that helped round out Sadie's understanding of her grandmother. Rebecca remembered Mom from before Marcus, during the brief period when she'd been a carefree young woman with dreams of travel and adventure. "Your grandma wanted to be a teacher," Rebecca told Sadie during one visit. "She loved children and was amazing at explaining complicated things in ways that made sense. She would have loved teaching you about books and science and art." "Why didn't she become a teacher?" Sadie asked. Rebecca and I exchanged glances, navigating the challenge of truthful but age-appropriate explanation. "Sometimes life takes us in different directions than we planned," Rebecca said carefully. "Grandma Sarah's most important job became protecting and loving your daddy, and she was so good at that job that she didn't have time for other jobs." These conversations helped Sadie understand that her family's history included both loss and love, challenge and triumph. She was developing a nuanced understanding of how people could face difficult circumstances while still creating joy and connection. Most importantly, she was learning that being part of our family meant being part of a legacy of people who'd chosen love over fear, even when fear would have been easier. As the book neared completion, I began receiving invitations to speak at larger venues about family safety and trauma recovery. The most significant was an invitation to address the National Conference on Domestic Violence Prevention, where I'd be sharing the stage with congressional representatives who were working on legislation to improve law enforcement's response to stalking cases. Preparing for this presentation forced me to think more broadly about the policy implications of our family's experience. Marcus had been able to maintain his false identity for decades, partly because information systems weren't sophisticated enough to detect the kind of identity fraud he'd committed. He'd been able to monitor our family's activities partly because privacy protections for victims weren't comprehensive enough to prevent determined predators from accessing personal information. The legislation being proposed would address some of these systemic issues. It would create better coordination between federal and state databases for tracking stalking cases, provide additional resources for long-term victim protection, and establish training standards for law enforcement officers handling domestic violence situations. During my presentation, I emphasized the importance of understanding stalking as a long-term crime that required long-term solutions. Most people think of stalking as immediate harassment that can be solved with a restraining order, I told the audience. But sophisticated stalkers, like the one who targeted my family, understand how to stay just within legal boundaries while maintaining a campaign of psychological terrorism that can last for decades. The solution isn't just better law enforcement response, though that's crucial, I continued. It's also about creating support systems that allow victim families to live full lives while staying safe. My mother spent 26 years protecting our family, but she didn't do it alone. She had the help of victim advocates, FBI specialists, local police, school officials, neighbors, and friends. It takes a community to defeat a predator. The response to the presentation was overwhelming. Afterward, I was approached by representatives from 3 different foundations that wanted to fund expanded training programs based on our family's experience. A victims' rights organization offered to help me establish a nonprofit focused specifically on families dealing with long-term stalking situations. Most significantly, Congresswoman Patricia Martinez, who'd sponsored the stalking prevention legislation, asked if I'd be willing to testify before a House subcommittee about the need for better federal coordination in domestic violence cases. "Your family's story illustrates perfectly why we need this legislation," she explained. "Your mother was essentially functioning as an intelligence analyst for 26 years. gathering and documenting evidence that law enforcement agencies couldn't effectively process or act upon. We need systems that can support families like yours more efficiently and effectively. The opportunity to potentially influence national policy felt like the natural culmination of the advocacy work I'd been doing since Marcus's arrest. If our family's nightmare could help create better protections for other families, then the suffering would serve a purpose beyond just our personal growth and healing. Emma was supportive of my increased involvement in policy work, but she also made sure I didn't lose sight of the balance we'd worked so hard to achieve. "You're doing important work," she told me as I prepared for the congressional testimony. "But remember that the best way to honor your mother's sacrifice is to live the free and joyful life she fought to make possible. Don't let your advocacy work become another form of hypervigilance." Her warning was wise. I could feel myself getting pulled back into the intensive focus on threat assessment and protection strategies that had dominated my family's life for so long. The difference was that now I was applying that focus to helping others, rather than protecting myself, but the psychological patterns were similar. "I want Sadie to see her father as someone who helps people," I said, "but I also want her to see him as someone who can be present and relaxed with his family." "Then make sure you're both," Emma replied simply. The congressional testimony went well, and the legislation passed with bipartisan support 6 months later. The new law established better information sharing between agencies investigating stalking cases, provided funding for specialized training programs, and created grant opportunities for organizations working with long-term stalking victims. When President Martinez signed the bill into law, she invited several of the advocates who'd worked for its passage to attend the ceremony. Standing in the Rose Garden as she put her signature on legislation that might protect other families from experiencing what we'd endured, felt surreal and deeply meaningful. "This bill is named for all the victims and survivors who never got the protection they deserved," the president said during her remarks. "But it's inspired by families like the Chens, who refused to let their traumatic experience be the end of their story. They turned their pain into purpose, their survival into service." After the ceremony, I called Dad from the steps of the White House to share the moment with him. "Mom would be so proud," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said that everything we went through would be worth it if it helped even one other family stay safe." The book was published the following spring, coinciding with the first anniversary of the new federal legislation. The launch event was held at our local library, the same library where Mom had taken me for story time every Tuesday when I was little, carefully timing our visits to avoid predictable patterns that might be observed by watchers. Sadie, now 5 years old, introduced me at the event with a speech she'd practiced for weeks. "My daddy wrote a book about our family," she told the audience, with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her right to take up space in the world. "It's about how love is stronger than scary things, and how brave people take care of each other." The book's reception exceeded my expectations. It spent 6 weeks on the bestseller list, not because it was a sensational true crime story, but because readers connected with the themes of family resilience and the power of love to overcome persistent threats. The book sparked conversations about domestic violence, family safety, and the long-term impact of trauma that extended far beyond the typical policy discussions. More importantly, it connected me with hundreds of other survivors and their families. I received letters from adult children who'd grown up under similar circumstances, parents who were currently protecting their families from threats, and professionals who worked with domestic violence victims. Each letter reminded me that our family's story was part of a much larger tapestry of human courage and resilience. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a woman named Catherine, whose teenage son had been stalked by a classmate's father after he'd reported the classmate for bullying behavior. The stalking had escalated to the point where Catherine's family had to move to a different state and change their names. "Reading your book helped my son understand that having his childhood disrupted by someone else's obsession didn't make him damaged or doomed," Catherine wrote. "He's been struggling with anger about the years we lost to fear, but your story helped him see that we didn't lose those years. We used them to stay safe so we could have all the years that followed." More importantly, her letter continued, "Your book helped me forgive myself for not being able to give him the carefree childhood I'd always dreamed of providing. You showed me that sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is safety, even when that safety requires sacrifice. Letters like Catherine's reinforced my understanding that healing from family trauma isn't just an individual process, it's a collective one. When we share our stories honestly and without shame, we give other people permission to understand their experiences differently, to forgive themselves for choices they were forced to make, and to recognize their survival as an achievement rather than just an accident. As Sadie entered kindergarten, she began asking more sophisticated questions about family differences and the challenges some people face. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, mentioned during a parent conference that Sadie had shown unusual maturity and empathy when a classmate talked about having to move frequently because of her parents' work. Sadie told the other child that moving a lot can actually be an adventure and that families do whatever they need to do to take care of each other, Mrs. Rodriguez reported. She seemed to understand that sometimes families make choices that look difficult from the outside but make sense for their specific situation. These glimpses of Sadie's developing worldview suggested that she was absorbing the lessons of our family history in healthy ways. She was learning that people face different challenges, that adults sometimes have to make hard choices to protect their families, and that love can take many forms, including forms that require sacrifice. When Sadie turned 6, we decided it was time to start sharing more specific details about her grandmother's life and the challenges our family had faced. We began with picture books about families that look different from the outside, then gradually introduced concepts about people who make bad choices and the adults who work to keep everyone safe from those choices. Some people have trouble understanding how to treat other people kindly, I explained during one of these conversations. When that happens, other people, like police officers and judges and family members, work together to make sure everyone stays safe. Like superheroes? Sadie asked. Exactly like superheroes, I said, pulling her close. And the most important superhero of all was your grandma Sarah, who used love instead of superpowers to keep our whole family safe. Sadie smiled and snuggled deeper into my arms, satisfied with this explanation. As I looked down at her peaceful face, I realized this was exactly what Mom had fought for, a child who could hear about danger and still feel completely secure, who could understand that bad things sometimes happened without being afraid they would happen to her. The attic above us no longer held secrets, just memories and dreams. The house around us no longer felt like a fortress, just a home. And the little girl in my arms represented everything good that could grow from the ashes of fear when it was nurtured by unwavering love. The monsters were gone, but the love remained. And that was the only inheritance that truly mattered. The end.